So we're in chapter 18 of your U.S. history book, and we were talking about the presidents from Grant. We went through President Grant, President Rutherford B. Hayes, on to Garfield, James Garfield, the assassination of Garfield, to the next vice president who became president, Chet Arthur. And now we were focusing in on Grover Cleveland. I went over some of the aspects of Grover Cleveland. He was the first Democratic president since Abraham Lincoln. So all the other presidents had been Republican. And he had won the election. He became a favorite. He's not one of my favorite presidents as I looked into his life. Grover Cleveland, he lived 1837 to 1896. And some of the things to know about him. First of all, Cleveland is known as the 22nd president, and he's also the 24th president. He's the only president that becomes president not consecutively. Basically, he's the 22nd, then he comes back as the 24th president twice, but not in order. And after he wins in the elections of 1884 and 1892, general elections, but he lost in 1888 to his Republican foe, Benjamin Harrison. So I put Benjamin there to Benjamin Harrison. So he's the only Democrat from Lincoln to Taft. So you'll find even after him, not until President Taft was brought in the Democratic Party. And then we'll know that with Woodrow Wilson. So anyway, Grover Cleveland. His real name was not Grover, it was Stephen. But they used to, because he was a very big man, he was tall, I think he was over 6 foot, and he weighed up to 300 pounds. So he was a big guy. And so they call him Big Steve or something, but he didn't like this. He ended up going with his name as Grover, and he used his name Grover in the presidency. His middle name was Grover, and so he used that. He may have been tired of using the name Stephen Cleveland, maybe he didn't want everybody to call him Stephen Cleveland. That would be kind of funny, huh? But anyway, he didn't want to be called Big Steve, The fitness magazine named him as the least healthiest president because of his beer drinking and cigar smoking. So he wasn't really healthy. He was overweight. He drank a lot of alcohol and beer, smoked a lot. Basically in the midst, he was a bachelor when he came in, and we'll find out that he gets married during his presidency. He has this big, huge, gigantic marriage. So he was a teacher at first in New York Institute for the Blind. He taught in the Institute of the Blind in Manhattan. So he probably knew how to do sign language, huh? But anyway, he was a teacher in that institute before he decided to pursue a legal career. Then he ran for office in both Buffalo and in New York, and he became a state reformer. He was a politician who fought against corruption. So in New York, he came that kind of a police chief type politician, governor. In 1882, he became Buffalo's mayor, and in 1883, he became the mayor or the governor of New York. So he became the governor of New York. So he had a prestigious position then as governor of New York. Cleveland's life, first of all, his father was a Presbyterian minister of New Jersey and moved to New York. So he was of the fifth of 9 children. So he's right in the middle there of how many children. So he had a large family. He also, during his presidency, and before his presidency, when he was running for president, they found out that there was a scandal that he had an illegitimate child, and he was involved in a paternity case, in which he admitted that he had paid child support in 1874 to a woman who claimed that he was the father of her child. So this became a huge scandal during that time. Later on, we do find out that he definitely admitted to this and did pay child support. He had a terrible relationship with this woman. Not to know even if she was a prostitute, we're not sure. But he basically, labeled her as such. He labeled her as insane and all these other things. So, but the thing is, he tried to keep that as secret. And as this came out, it gave him very negative because they called him Good Grover. But after the scandal came out, they looked to him like, oh, he has more problems than we thought, right? So that he still became president of the United States even after the scandal. So Cleveland didn't fight in the Civil War. He wasn't a general as the other presidents were. In fact, he paid a Polish immigrant some money to serve his place in the war. He didn't even go to war. Instead, he paid for someone to take his position when he was drafted. So that's kind of so far we have two negative things here I really don't like much about Grover Cleveland. He was Cleveland's first political office. He was the sheriff of Erie County of New York, and during his first term, he carried out the death sentences by hanging of 3 convicted murderers. So he's basically that type of judge chief type of person even as president. In 1886, Cleveland married Frances Folsom. She lived 1864 to 1947. The thing about Frances is that she was the daughter of his business partner, right? And his business partner ended up dying, and so he kind of helped take care of the family. At that time, she was only 12 years old. So when she became 21, she went to college, and at 21, he decided that he wanted to marry her. And so he was 27 years older than her, which is quite a deal because he was close to 50 and she's like 21. But at that time, that wasn't considered so much of an enigma. Frances married him and became the youngest first lady in the United States history. And they ended up having 5 children together. But anyway, he was the only president to get married in the White House, and they had this very elaborate wedding ceremony, and the whole world looked on at Grover Cleveland, president, getting married in the White House, which was first that had ever happened in U.S. history. So Grover Cleveland vetoed twice as many congressional bills as all 21 of the presidents who preceded him combined. 414 vetoes in his first term. So whenever they tried to get a bill passed, the Republicans tried to get a bill passed, he would veto them and veto them and veto them. So he was known for that. Some people think, well, he needed to veto some of those, but others think that was his police mentality, that kind of, like, okay, I don't like this one, I don't like this one, so he kept vetoing. So basically he was very much of, let's keep things status quo. So then the next election happened, and we have Benjamin Harrison running for president, Republican. Now, when you think of the name Harrison, who do you think of? Well, I hope you would think there was another president named Harrison. Remember William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe and Tyler too was his thing, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and then his grandfather was William Henry Harrison, and he was only in the presidency for like a few days, like 30 days or so, because he basically got pneumonia from his basically standing up and giving his inaugural address in the rain and such. He got sick and he got pneumonia and he died. So he was only president for like a month, And his Vice President Tyler became president. And we went through that before. So, but just to say, he was the grandson of another president. And also during this time, there was a populist movement by James Weaver, who was also a candidate of a new political party called the Populist Party. So the populist movement, let's talk about the populist movement. This is not about Benjamin Harrison now, but about this movement. The populist movement was because farmers were interested in politics now. We had the Grange, remember, and that kind of faded out, and then we have the Farmers Alliance. And so the populist movement was called the People's Party, called the Populist Party. And what they wanted, and some of these things are good, and we ended up later on knowing that they did come through, but the Populist Party didn't last that long. But what the Populist Party wanted, they wanted free coinage of silver. Why do you think silver? Because farmers, of course, they wanted to be able to have their money to be inflated a bit so that they could pay off their loans. So also, they increase of paper money, again, to pay off loans. They also wanted a progressive income tax. Before this time, we didn't have an income tax. So the very wealthy people did not have to pay taxes then. And so they wanted an income tax. Number 4, they wanted the government ownership and the control of transportation and communication. So basically they wanted the government the transportation, especially the railroads, and now on to the communication of the telegraph, they thought needed to have the government come in and supervise what was going on because they were interstate activities. They wanted direct election of the senators by voters, the senators to be voted in, which they are now, and the adoption of referendum and secret ballots, of the voters. So they would have secret ballots. And restrictions on the vast amount of immigrants who were coming, especially Chinese immigrants that were coming in on the West Coast. They wanted to have some restrictions so that convicts and, people that came in with absolute poverty and, other problems, diseases, they wanted to be able to have restrictions on some of these immigrants that were coming in at this time. They also wanted fewer working hours for labor, just an 8-hour day, and to have overtime pay. So this is what the People's Party came in, and a lot of these things we have now, but they representing the people, and James Weaver being a candidate for president during this time. The Populist Party, and it was in 1896. And here we have the rise and fall of James Weaver. The Populist Party actually organized out of Omaha, Nebraska. And that's where James Weaver actually was from Iowa, but they would organize in Omaha. So, and he was the presidential candidate from Iowa. And he won many votes. 1833 to 1912 is when he lived. And during this time, he also was a friend of a really famous candidate. We'll find a young man at this time from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, we'll go on to learn more about him. He would run for president 3 more times. He never became president, but he became famous, and he was supported, more of a populist brand of party, especially the farmers. He was stationed basically his home in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, in fact. And William Jennings Bryan, he claimed to be born-again Christian. He actually was in the lawsuit, the Scopes trial, and I won't go into that, against evolution, but he was really against evolution being taught in the schools. So I have admiration, although he stood up for some things I didn't agree. Here's a picture of him, of William Jennings Bryan. While James Weaver won for president, Bryan was around during that time. In 1896, the political force, the candidate, basically this whole populist party would start to die out and not run again. But William Jennings Bryan would run under the Democratic Party. So the farmers improving circumstance, new markets in foreign nations, These things were important. And gold was discovered in Alaska, and this put more gold in circulation. These things caused the political populist outlook to become less, because now we had more gold, that we could have more of our money backed in gold instead of silver. Because we'll find out, especially with Brian, he'd want silver backage. In fact, he was against having everything backed in gold. So our money, basically saying your money is worth gold, and putting more inflation. So, but anyway, the farmers, though, became less politically active and aggressive after this time. So, with the Populist Party. And we have the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And the Sherman Antitrust, just what it says, antitrust. It was against those big trusts or those big pooling monopolies of business. The Sherman Antitrust was formed because of this. They saw these companies such as the Carnegie Steel Company with the steel company, and on to the Standard Oil with the Rockefellers controlling everything. So they decided to put an act against these huge trusts. And they declared that any trusts or similar agreements that restrained interstate or international trade would be illegal. One of the things. And also to promote competition, so that the small businesses would have opportunities to sell their goods despite the control of these big monopolies. But the Supreme Court limited the power, defining the restraint of trade, and this increased the regulation of business. So the Sherman Antitrust and the Interstate Commerce Act, they both limited big business. Remember, under Grover Cleveland, we have that interstate commerce, the ICC and the ICA. They limited big business, and now the Sherman Antitrust would limit big business. Here's a picture of Sherman here. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed. The law was aimed to combat the restraint of trade or commerce caused by trusts. The act was ineffective or about 15 years because the federal government rarely enforced it. I didn't know that. But anyway, here's a picture of Sherman and the Antitrust Act of 1890. Pretty important. It's a regulation now of these big businesses. The Homestead Strike of 1892. So now we're talking about the time of Harrison, right? Benjamin Harrison has become president, and there would be another strike, a big strike. Grover Cleveland during that time was a strike. We have these strikes going on, and a lot of them are instigated, like I said before. So the Carnegie Steel Company. Now we're talking about the steel company in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was known for its steel company, especially Pittsburgh, but this was in Homestead. Here's a picture of it going on. They were demanding more production from their workers. And so the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, that's the Labor Party, that's the union, got together and they went on strike. Here's a picture of going on strike. The plant manager got very upset and locked the strikers out and sent out 300 guards. And then it turned violent and 16 people were killed. So again, the strike went violent, and as people looked on and thinking, oh, these labor unions now are causing problems. What is going on? But the plant manager asked for help from the government. So an anarchist, remember anarchists are involved in trying to basically go in and instigate these strikers to get violent. And so an anarchist attempted to assassinate the plant manager. So in 5 months, the strike ended and the labor union was destroyed. So this gave a bad name to unions, and violence seemed to prevail through these strikes. So another strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Now again, why couldn't they get together and discuss these things, on workers, comp and these different things for workers? But instead, they would be led into violent situations. Okay, a little more about Benjamin Harrison. He lived 1833 to 1901, becoming the 23rd president. He followed the example of his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, all the way to the White House. While his support for protective tariffs led to rising prices for the consumers and arguably paved the way for the nation's future economic woes, his bold pursuit of Americans' foreign policy goals, including his proposal to annex Hawaii to the United States, displayed his expanded vision of the nation's role in world affairs. So basically, he had, especially in dealing with Hawaii, a very good thing happening there, right? Hawaii becoming a state. He was the last Civil War general to serve as President of the United States. So he was a general in the Civil War. And he stood only 5 feet 6 inches tall. So he was called Little Ben by his Democratic opponents, and call him Little Ben. And he became president during the centennial. As Washington, compared to him, he was a very small-minded president, right, compared to most. Although his life was pretty honest and upright. From 1881 to 1887, Harrison represented Indiana in the U.S. Senate, arguing for the rights of homesteaders and Native Americans against the expanding railroad industry, and campaigning for general pensions for the Civil War veterans. So he wanted veterans of the Civil War to get money pensions, and he stood up even for the Native Americans. He was highly principled and devoutly religious man. He was a Christian. And Harrison broke with the Republican Party to oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act. So during this time in 1882, the Congress put forth an act which would exclude Chinese people from immigrating into the United States during a specific period of time. And he opposed that. He thought it was being very prejudiced against the Chinese people in doing this. But the Congress were going forth because so many Chinese people were coming in to the west coast of California and Oregon area, coming in, and they wanted to stop so many from coming in. They put forth this Exclusion Act. But Benjamin Harris opposed it. Harrison's loss to Cleveland. Rather than travel around the country during the campaign, he gave numerous speeches to delegations and visited them in Indianapolis. This is called front porch campaigning. We'll find that he did this, and also the next president did too, McKinley. One of the reasons McKinley did because his wife was sick, and I think Harrison had some problem with his wife being sick too during this time. So he decided to just do the front porch campaign, when he would basically give his campaign speech on his front porch and people would come and listen. In the general election, when I say front porch, in his area, it wasn't really just on his front porch, So I just had to, but they would come to him. In general election, Grover Cleveland, went against him, along with a third-party challenge from the populist people, which we told about, Weaver. And so he stood and lost. He was losing to Grover Cleveland. I say one of the reasons because the party was really split here from the populist party from the Republicans, and ended up Grover Cleveland would become president. It says in Revelation that Carolyn Harrison was seriously ill, led him to limit his appearances, contributing to the margin of his defeat. So Carolyn died of tuberculosis in October, and 2 weeks later, Harrison lost to Cleveland. So during this time, he had a hard time campaigning because his wife was dying of tuberculosis, you can imagine. So he ended up losing to Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland becomes president in 1893 to 1897, again, his second time being president. So In fact, I think his wife, after Harrison became president, she said, well, we will be back. Don't move my things around much. We'll be back in 4 years. And guess what? They were back. And she's a little spicy little 21-year-old, saying, we'll be back. So they came back. A panic, march, and strikes. The Panic of 1893 then happened. Grover Cleveland's next presidency didn't go as well as his first presidency. So the Panic of 1893 happened and was followed by a depression that lasted his whole term. In 1894, Jacob Coxey of Ohio led a group of 500 men in a march on Washington, D.C., demanding relief. They called this Coxey's Army. And Cleveland had Coxey's Army arrested as soon as they trespassed and they got close to the White House, to the Capitol building. He had them arrested right away on the grass before Coxey got any closer. So he knew they were coming. Otherwise, they were coming and attacking. So then happened the Pullman strike, another labor strike in 1894. And this is one of the most important strikes that we need to know about. It began in Chicago with the Pullman Car Company. Pullman Car Company, when you think of car company, not automobiles, they were trains, cars. The trains, the different section of trains were called the cars of the train, right? And so the Pullman Car Company that made these cars that went on the trains went into strike. And they called it the American Railroad Union Strike. And 27 states were affected because they all had, a railroad union. They all had railroads. Much violence happened during this time and much destruction of property. And they even hindered the mail, the post office, because basically the trains, they would supply transit for the mail, right? So, and during this time we have this guy named Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs had become a communist, infiltrated communist, instigator of communism and such. And we'll find him later on actually running for the communist president of the United States, which he never got, thank God. But anyway, so Eugene Debs, employed President Cleveland employed the Sherman Antitrust Act to stop the strike, the Pullman strike, and the American Railroad Union in restraint of trade. So he wanted to stop this strike. In the midst, we have Eugene Debs being an instigator of the strike. Like I said before, communists and socialists came in and instigated so they could make everything worse and they could come in and take over, right? That's one of the tactics of communism. So Eugene Debs was arrested and he went to jail as an instigator in the Pullman strike. And he later became the leader of American Socialists, Communists in America. Debs ran for president 5 times on the Socialist Party ticket. He never won. And then union leaders became increasingly powerful during this time, but only 3% of the workers were union members. So if you went to work for a company, it was only 3% of the workers were union members, but they were still very powerful and they were instigated by anarchists to violence. In the midst of all this, we have after Grover Cleveland going through and Cleveland not coming through in a lot of different areas and failing in areas. I have to say one of the greatest failures of Grover Cleveland was that he wanted to stop the Depression era. And in order to stop the Depression era, he went and made a deal with J.P. Morgan, the banker, and the banker representing the banks outside of the country, including the Rothschild Bank and such in England, and making a deal with them and have them supply and pay them interest so that they could stop the Depression. And people did not like that idea that Grover Cleveland went to J.P. Morgan, big business, to help him. So Grover Cleveland was not one of the favorite presidents at that time. So the next president would be William McKinley, 25th president, and he was from Ohio. I'm going to go over him more in the next video, but just to know that he got in because of the McKinley Tariff of 1890. So he had high protective tariffs, and higher tariffs than ever before, in fact. And he protected the farmers on the wheat and corn and potatoes, even despite the tariffs. So he had the reciprocity clause that offered a reciprocal trade agreement to foreign nations, allowing certain raw materials to come in the country duty-free, despite these high tariffs. And later he was replaced, the tariffs were replaced by this major issue in the election, and later on the tariffs were changed. But President McKinley was assassinated shortly after his second term before he could carry out a lot of the tariffs. So another assassination. So I'm going to stop there because we're getting kind of long, but this is going to be the end of this chapter, and we're going to get into chapter 19, which will go in and we'll go over some more things that have happened during these presidencies, especially during McKinley as president. I'm going to talk more about his assassination. Okay.